My father is a noble man, but his rule is failing. And our people lose faith. He looks to me to make things right, and I would do it. I would see the glory of Gondor restored. Have you ever seen his Aragorn? White Tower of Ecthelion, glimmering like a spike of pearl and silver. Its banners caught high in a morning breeze. Have you ever been called home by the clear ringing of silver trumpets?
I have seen the White City. Long ago.
One day, our paths will lead us there. And the Tower Guard shall take up the call. The Lords of Gondor have returned.
With Amazon taking the reins to a series that has been near and dear to my heart, a thought that absolutely scares me. I look back through cinema history to remember what made Lord of the Rings special, to not only me, but to every single one of us who watched it. A series that has withstood the test of time, the weathering of powerful storms, the greed of corporations, and the neutering of fantasy itself. A series that brings chills to my soul when I see the charge of the Rohirrim, the last stand of man against the Black Gate of Mordor, of the desperate moment on the peaks of Mount Doom, or of an exchange of hope between broken men. I want to take you on a brief expedition into the Lord of the Rings, to remind you that there are things worth fighting for. While I will be mentioning the books, I want to tell the story through the lens of the movies. Created by the legendary J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings began its journey on July 29, 1954, with the Fellowship of the Ring, an epic battle taking place in Mordor against the forces of darkness, of a story that tells of the rings of power being forged between the three major factions of the world of Middle-earth, of a bloodline that was cursed for generations on the folly of a man, entering into an age of strife and darkness, never truly free from the corruption that besets men. True freedom was never obtained because of one simple incident, before the catalyst of that calamity was lost to time, to history, for 2,500 years. Only, it was found again. The story of the Lord of the Rings is a simple one, of good versus evil, of taking the first step in a grander journey that has dire consequences. And frankly, it doesn't need to be complex, nor have complex themes, nor the sense of ambiguity that plagues many a fantasy now. The story begins grand, before backing up and filling in the shoes, or lack thereof, of a hobbit. A simple creature in the politics and intrigue of a world stumbling upon the most powerful object within Middle-earth, and equally the most dangerous. With the return of the One Ring, set ablaze with black speech inscriptions upon the golden band, brings with it a dire warning, one that a powerful wizard has yet to understand until finding the truth hidden within dusty documents of a bygone era. Soon enough, events that fall out of the control of the Hobbit brings him and his friends to Rivendell, an idyllic elven refuge hidden within the forest and mountains of Eredin, before a call is sent to the kingdoms of Middle-earth to discuss a proposition. Take the One Ring and destroy it from whence it was forged, within the fires of Mount Doom itself. And though they argue and bicker among themselves, the hobbit that had brought this ring, this creature of innocence and nature, says, "I will take it," inspiring men, elves, dwarves, and even those who were tagged along to set out on that very same journey with a fellowship of 9 towards Mount Doom, to free Middle-earth from that eternal darkness that would come. While Tolkien set a high standard with his story, Wizards with pointy hats, high and mighty elves, dwarves being underground hoarders of treasure and incredible warriors, men standing as the race while the most susceptible to corruption would inevitably grow past their boundaries or fall victim to them. There are many to this day who are quick to criticize the style that he presented. I know. I was one such individual at a point in my life where I was more down than up. That saw this childish fantasy of good versus evil as nothing more than an overused trope that was an excuse for lazy writing. Latching on to Game of Thrones, a fantasy series that fulfilled the dark niche and style that I desired for so long until it wasn't anymore. I was wrong. While Game of Thrones prided itself upon the subversion of expectations and the dark reality of fantasy itself, parading around that life isn't fair and that no one, regardless of how powerful they were invincible. How the intricacies of politics within the Song of Ice and Fire played out of noble houses and royal families, and petty politics played out on a grand scale, or the world of The Witcher, and the stories of sorceresses and travelling monster hunters, of an organization lost to the crawl of time, and the remaining few survivors using the trade to maintain a living. Love between two bewitched by a gin in the bottle. These stories had forgotten something along the way. Hope. Because, George, you can complain about how Tolkien never established a tax policy for the Kingdom of Gondor, or how there is no plan for the surviving orcs, or your bashing of the vagueness that Tolkien left. However, Tolkien finished his story. Have you? Lord of the Rings gives the concept that even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost and forgotten, that even though the darkness seems overwhelming, there is light at the end of the tunnel, that there are things worth fighting for in the world, that even in my darkest moment, there was light at the end of it all, and I'm a better person because of it. Tolkien created one of the most powerful escapist literature of his time, that even after Game of Thrones, after Witcher, after the waves of dark fantasy and grimdark, we still remember the Horn of Helm Hammerhand and the tune of Hobbiton, the charge of the Black Gate against overwhelming odds, and yet we still march forward.
This city was once the jewel of our kingdom, a place of light and beauty and music, and so it shall be once more! Let the armies of Mordor know this. Never again will the land of my people fall into enemy hands! The city of Osgiliath has been reclaimed! For Gondor! For Gondor! For Gondor! For Gondor!
Flaws are what make a person who they are, because none of us are perfect, none of us will be. And for Middle-earth, the race of men are far from flawless. I know, a bit of a jump, but allow me to explain. You can have a fantasy world crafted in intricate detail, and stories that provide the foundation and framework for what you intend to craft, but for it to feel truly alive, you need characters. A catalyst for you to invert into, a way for the story and events to flow that doesn't feel like a documentary. They can be nuanced or simple, cowards or fighters, a small player or a king, but at the end, they need to exist. Otherwise, they'll be nothing more than empty shells that exist in a world. They deserve an arc of transformation that takes them upon that journey and that first step. As fascinating as it was to see Jon Snow, yes, I know, another bashed Game of Thrones, or Tyrion Lannister, they went from characters with conflicted backgrounds and personal ideologies and environments that forged them into who they are. They experienced no growth past a certain point, only reverting to McQueen, or Hand of the King that is more incompetent than his character allowed. Let's contrast with 3 specific examples: Boromir, Merry, and Eowyn. Boromir, while a charismatic leader and a born fighter, a faithful brother to his much neglected one, he is burdened with the fate of his home, the fate of the kingdom of Gondor from his father, the steward of Gondor. He's human, high-strung, but he's far from perfect, bitter and spiteful that he had to endure the mantle of leadership. To see his brothers die time and again against the forces of Mordor for years now, he feels responsible to see past the fading light of Gondor and towards a future where the race of men flourishes. Yet a heartfelt conversation with Aragorn reveals that he knows his father is a failing figurehead, that his country has endured brutal fighting for so long, but he still feels the pride that the White City provides, of the banners flying in the wind, of the silver trumpets, of the Tower Guard, and of the ones who have stood by him. With the One Ring, it provides an opportunity to have Gondor stand toe-to-toe with Mordor. And at first, Boromir recognizes how dangerous it could be. However, his time spent with the Fellowship reveals the true desperation he feels. How he sees that the ring could be used, even ever so briefly, to restore power to his country. And it takes one mistake.
No! Give me the... No! I see your mind. You will take the ring to Sauron! You will betray us! You go to your death, and the death of us all! Curse you! Curse you! And all our place!
One mistake and he realizes what he's done, but by then it's too late. Calling out to Frodo, begging for forgiveness, even as the Uruk-hai begin to descend upon the Fellowship. Though rather than wallow in the self-pity, he charges ahead with his actions rather than words, fighting the nearly endless amounts of the monsters who threaten his compatriots. And he fights until the very end. And when Aragorn finds him on the verge of death, his concern is not of himself, but of those he had failed to protect. And he admits his failure, and he is not forsaken. And his final conversation with Aragorn says all that needs to be said.
I would have followed you, my brother. My captain. My king.
My brother, my captain, my king. The death of Boromir carries ramifications for the rest of the series, and his sacrifice is not forgotten by the man who swore to not let the White City fall, turning him from a wayward ranger to the king that Gondor needed. On the opposite end is Merry, a companion of Frodo and his best friend Pippin, a hobbit that happened upon the party to travel to Rivendell and eventually entering into the Fellowship. With the fight against the Uruk-hai in Amon Hen, he along with Pippin are taken to be brought back to Isengard, for they are believed to have the One Ring. Though freed by chance of a Rohirrim patrol, two come into contact with the Ents of Fangorn. While the Battle of Hornburg is happening, he and Pippin desperately attempt to convince the trees of the forest to rally to the support of men, though they refuse. Only after witnessing the destruction of many of his kin, does Treebeard decide to act, eventually returning to the company of Aragorn and Rohan. The respite is only brief before calamity happens once more, where Pippin is forced to leave the Gondor. The two inseparable brothers are forced away by circumstances before the beacons are lit, where Gondor requires dire aid. Does the King of Rohan answer, where Merry answers the call?
So, it is before the walls of Minas Tirith the doom of our time will be decided.
Now is the hour! Riders of Rohan! Oaths you have taken! Now fulfill them all! To lord and land! Now!
And upon the top of Dunharrow, preparing to fight the coming conflict, he is mocked by Éomer for someone so small wanting to fight, though his words are not without merit.
You know as little of war as that hobbit. When the fear takes him, and the blood and the screams and the horror of battle take hold, do you think he would stand and fight? He would flee, and he would be right to do so. War is the province of men, Eowyn.
The battlefield, a dangerous, evil, terrifying place. That any act of cowardice, it would be understandable. Denied by the very king of Rohan himself, claiming to be a burden, even though Mary displays a genuine desire to fight. A hobbit, who happens to be within the grand conflict of his time, is told no. Something that almost crushes his spirit, as the king rides off without him. Though the shield maiden of Rohan, Éowyn, picks him up onto a horse, the only one who encouraged he should fight. Upon arriving within the battlefield of Pelennor, does he begin to initially regret it, only for the king himself to call for death.
Ride for ruin, and the world stands
Death to those who would dare destroy their very existence, and invigorated, makes the charge to death itself. Fighting through the field, the power nearly extinguished by a passing Oliphant that was taken down. Reunited when Éowyn is on the verge of defeat. A single dagger, a single act of courage, gives Mary the strength and spirit. As the brothers unite under a dusty field of battle, the two would go on to give their friend a fighting chance on the peaks of Mount Doom, or they would die trying. As Aragorn leads the charge, the two, despite their size, despite their origins, fearlessly charge behind the king himself for their friend, leading the vanguard for the final fight of Middle-earth. Merry may act as comic relief initially, but his actions, his heroism, earns him the respect of the king, who despite his newfound status and position, returns to his roots, to Hobbiton. No matter the size of the creature, they can always make a difference. The shield maiden of Rohan, Éowyn, was kept sheltered, but she was not one to stand idly by while men did all the fighting. And through her darkest moments before Aragorn arrives, her adopted brother Theodred killed, Éomer exiled, her adoptive father a pale shadow of himself, before Grima comes to comfort, or rather, to poison her mind of the corruption. The same corruption that allowed Theoden to fall to his state.
Leave me alone, Snake!
But you are alone. Who knows what you've spoken to the darkness in the bitter watches of the night, when all your life seems to shrink, the walls of your bower closing in about you, a hutch to trammel some wild thing.
Though she breaks away from his influence for a time, the arrival of the remnants of the Fellowship is a turning point. And while she is relegated to an escort role for a time, it's when the Rohirrim are called to Dunharrow under the guise of wishing to see the men off,
only to find herself one of their ranks. Bringing Merring with her onto the field of battle, she can fight just as well as any other man. She doesn't validate it through words, but rather action. It isn't the entirety of her identity. She does want to prove him wrong, but it isn't directly shoved into the face of the viewer.
I am no man.
With the death of the Witch King and the passing of her father, broken physically, and her love rejecting her, it's when she finds the comforting embrace of Faramir and the House of Healing. The point of this section is perhaps a bit moot and dragged on a bit, but here it is. These are not characters who remind us of the daily struggles that we all desire to escape from. They are ideal versions of who we strive to be, a catalyst to immerse ourselves in this grander-than-life world. Fantasy, if you will. I'll never be Boromir the warrior, but I can strive to be selfless, to help others in their time of need, to be an example when others need me to be human. We all make mistakes, but the difference is that some lie down and accept it. Others admit their faults, but move past them and strive to be better.
The setting of Middle-earth, which used New Zealand as the background, fills in the greater gaps of the world that it presents. Each location around has a specific charm to it. Everything from the opening battle to the final shot of the Grey Havens has a distinct style that can never be forgotten. Hobbiton is a place of life, enjoyment, and a carefree environment that has no desire to stand in the darker reality of the world. Bree, a crossroad of travellers and traders that reveals the more ugly side of life itself. Before Rivendell, a time capsule of the elven heritage built in the physical form, of the great warriors and poets, the ageless men and women who roam these halls, knowing that soon their way of life will end and a new age will begin. To the pass of Cahadras and the mines of Moria, of the fall of the dwarves. I could go on, but you understand my point. Each location in Middle-earth tells a story, tells of the heritage and culture they portray, and of the heartbreak that some have come to realize. One of my favourite locations is Osgiliath, the broken frontier city of the Kingdom of Gondor, situated on the riverfront with East Osgiliath occupied by the Orcs of Mordor, while the west is controlled by the group of men fighting desperately to maintain control and keep those within the White Tower of Ixelion safe and those within reach. Reinforced by Captain Faramir and the Rangers of Ithilien, it soon becomes clear that this stalemate cannot last forever. Before one evening, in the dead of night, a Gondorian is shot dead, giving little warning to the defenders to take up positions, as through the fog, dozens of boats carrying countless orcs cross the river and the fighting commences. Carrying all the way into the early morning sun, the defenders fight on the losing battle. General retreat is called to the white city of Minas Tirith. Pursued by the Nazgul, the beleaguered defenders are saved by the White Wizard. Though this is unacceptable, a failure that will not and cannot be tolerated by the standing steward of Gondor. Captain Faramir is given the order, the command to retake the city, to win the approval of a father who had wished he had never even existed.
You wish now that our places have been exchanged, that I had died and Boromir had lived.
Yes. I wish that.
Since you were robbed of Boromir, I will do what I can in his stead.
Broken in spirit, Faramir, along with a cavalry group,
leads the charge across the field to the city, where archers wait in hiding. As they take aim, a broken captain, a broken man leads the vanguard, swords drawn and shining in the sun with his armor, as the arrows are released. Or perhaps we should go deeper. Outside of the corrupted fortress of Minas Morgul is a staircase, innocuous and curious, for if one were to climb the dizzying heights, you'll find a cave. A cave, cold and seemingly abandoned, filled with webs and corpses of those long deceased. Within the darkness, however, there is a sinister evil which stalks the unfortunate victims that stumble into that cave. Promises of a shortcut to inside Mordor. Gondorians, orcs, even elves have all fallen prey to the machinations of Shelob, a colossal spider that calls the cave its home. Though rumours have spoken after the fall of Mordor of hobbits, creatures unlikely to even make it so far from home, have passed through and even survived Shelob herself. So much story in one location, and that's just one of many. One of many that gives life to the world of Middle-earth. A story in itself could be told. How the city had fallen before the orcs, before the stalemate between Gondor and Mordor, before the eventual fall. Or how Shelob came to be, and how long that devilish creature had its way in those dark, decrepit halls. The soundtrack of Lord of the Rings is lovingly crafted by the legendary Howard Shore, who made an astounding craft that even still to this day has one of the most recognisable tunes, even on par with Star Wars itself, though it is an orchestra score. Each piece is recognisable with motifs that are still heard 20 years later. The tracks themselves tell a story, they fit the setting they're in, and they are nearly perfect. Jamie Altozano does an excellent job breaking down the intricacies of the music itself on the more technical and story aspect side. Fellowship theme has all 9 members in that opening track. The powerful tone of the Lothlorien elves that changes tempo based on the situation they're in.
Stay close, young hobbits. They say that a great sorceress lives in these woods.
Vaigivar, Dinalank, Anurank.
This task was appointed to you, Frodo of the Shire.
The theme of Rohan is one that fits the culture of the Horse Lords, of wide open lands and a powerful boom when arriving at the fields of Pelennor. One of the more haunting tracks for me is Pippin's song to Denethor, the angelic voice that is presented to tell the story, as Faramir, the last son of Denethor, charges the occupied city of Osgiliath. Told hours earlier that his own father would have preferred him dead over Boromir. The mental anguish that does to a man, and the final note as the song is played as the drop of red goes down the chin of Denethor, signifying the ultimate fate of his son. Another one is the charge at the Black Gate. For moments at a time, it's quiet, almost silent before the charge happens, which explodes in sound and emotion and power as the single man charges the army of Mordor alone. But let's cut back to the speech Aragorn gives before this moment. To see the gates open, the music signifies doubt, terror, fear. Seeing the endless hordes of orcs flow out of those dark lands would make even the most powerful men shudder in fear. But Aragorn comes in, and the music flows upward. A brief glimmer of hope. The King of Gondor would stand before the men he commanded. His words weave through them one by one as they turn to face the inevitable threat. Men of Rohan, of Gondor, as the speech concludes, ending with an overflowing amount of power and courage as the sword is drawn and Aragorn yells as his horse turns to face the eye of Sauron and his horde. The final scene I want to touch on is my personal favourite, the Ride of the Rohirrim, the arrival of the Rohan army to a nearly broken Minas Tirith, starting succulently with the horn of Rohan blaring out through the lowest point of the Gondorian defenders, approaching the crest of the hills. The music is soft as the horses line upon the hill itself, witnessing the army besieging it. The powerful booms, familiar with Sauron, fill the air, war drums signifying all but total victory. Then with it, silence, as they're awestruck, terrified. Then a horn slowly begins to build up as it cuts to Theoden, moving along the line and taking command. The tide of the pre-battle begins to turn. A brief speech builds on these horns as it ends on a hit. The first peak is a hit. The spears lower in the front line as Theoden goes down, smacking his blade against the wood, screaming, "Ride now!" The horn returns, the motif of Rohan, the one we've heard all too often, the clinks of the spears adding to the horns. Then comes death, a final battle cry of the Rohirrim, as they most certainly will ride to their death. But the music is not a somber affair. It's of a chance, however slim, of victory. The chanting of death is ended with the theme of Rohan and the phrase, and then a horn to complement the theme, before it quiets down, with the violin taking center stage. The brief calm before the inevitable storm that would follow. The violin builds with horns and the galloping of horses. The pace grows faster as the Rohirrim approach. The men are fearless despite the odds, and there is ever so briefly a falter as men fall to arrows, only for it to pick back up again, with more emotion, more power, the cavalry on the mere steps of them as it reaches the highest peak it can, before the colliding of horse upon orc takes the stage as the carnage and reality sets in. The battle has begun. However, we have yet to hit on the greatest point I want to talk about. The better title would be, what didn't Lord of the Rings influence? Even 20 years after the films, even 68 years after the release of the first book, people are still talking about it. From the several video games released after the films, to several now popular authors taking inspiration from Tolkien himself, Orson Scott Card, Stephen King, Terry Pratchett, Pat Murphy, J.K. Rowling, Harry Turtledove, Charles DeLint, Paul Anderson, Michael Swanwick, Karen Aber, even George R.R. Martin. All of them took influence from him. Even music itself was defined by Tolkien. Led Zeppelin, Megadeth, Nightwish, Sabaton, Magnum, Blind Guardians, all of whom wrote songs based on his work, or even bands inspired by his work. Bands such as Marlian, Gorgoroth, Burzum, Kiravangal, Amin Amroth. Even the lead singer, Abdimid Bojur, has the stage name of Shagrath, based on an orc captain. Not to mention the amount of influence he had on art and literature, with Tolkien basically being the term fantasy for 2 solid decades. The original 1977 Star Wars has almost a point-to-point comparison for Lord of the Rings itself. Comparing the two side by side will illuminate an almost perfect picture comparison. Point is, Tolkien was the forefront, and still is, for fantasy, even in the mid-2022. While this wasn't meant to be an analysis of the series, I couldn't help but dig into why I love the series so much. As a kid, I couldn't fully appreciate it, but now I have my deepest respect for a series that has withstood the test of time, and hopefully will keep it there. Game of Thrones may have taken the spotlight for a time, but with the lackluster ending in 2019, how many of you actually remember it? Remember 8 years of content, gone within 2. You remember the Battle of the Hornburg, the charge of the Black Gate, the White City of Minas Tirith, the charge of the Rohirrim, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Frodo, Sam, Gandalf, Boromir, Faramir, Eowyn. You remember that hope exists, and it's worth fighting for. Thank you so very much for watching.
I can't do this, Sam. I know. It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here. But we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing. This shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something. Even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going. Because they were holding on to something. What are we holding on to, Sam? That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting